Wheel the charity case back to North Hall. She's stinking up my lobby.
Grayson Pruitt barked, his voice echoing off the imported marble and the pristine chandeliers. He glared down at the new temp aide, a tall, unhurried black woman in faded gray scrubs and a cheap laminated badge that read Odessa G. Beside her sat an 86-year-old resident with a thread of oatmeal on her mouth. "Are you deaf?"
Are you deaf or are you just stupid?
His expensive cologne mixing with pure condescension. He thrust his finger right into her personal space, his face contorted in a sneer.
This is a premium memory care pavilion for real families, not a bus stop for Medicaid discards. Look at your wrinkled black skin. You look just as cheap as the trash you're wheeling. People like you are the exact reason we have a service entrance. Get out of my sight before I unrent your useless shift with one phone call.
Odessa didn't flinch. She quietly held the wheelchair grips, her silver-threaded hair still. Though a dangerous current shifted behind her eyes, Grayson laughed loudly, and his inner circle joined in to fuel the public humiliation. All of them completely unaware of the absolute destruction he had just engineered for his own career. Because Odessa G. was a lie. Her name was Odessa Grant. And she didn't just work here. She owned the deed, the license, and every single bed in the entire building. Grayson Pruitt had just handed a shovel to the woman who owned the ground he was standing on. He would spend the next 11 days digging loud and proud, and he would not understand what he had done until it was far, far too late. Let me tell you who she really was. Because to understand what happened in that building, you have to understand what happened in a different building, a very long time ago. To a woman who never got a chandelier, Odessa Grant was born in 1957, in Gary, Indiana, in the shadow of the steel mills, in a house that shook when the freight trains passed. Her father, Elias, poured steel for United States, steel for 31 years. And he came home every night smelling like the inside of a furnace. Her mother, Ruth Ann, was a caregiver, not a nurse. They wouldn't let black women be nurses at the good hospitals then. She was an aide. She emptied bedpans, and turned bodies, and held hands. At the county home, on the floor they still called. In 1971, the colored floor, Odessa was 14, the year her mother started coming home gray in the face. The county home kept the colored floor short-staffed on purpose. One aide for 30 beds, sometimes 40, while the white floor upstairs had one aide for 8. Ruth Ann worked doubles she was never paid for. Because if she didn't, the old people on her floor would lie in their own waste until the next shift. And she could not, would not, let that happen. Somebody has to see them. She told Odessa, if nobody sees them, they die twice. Ruth Ann Grant collapsed on that floor in the spring of 1972, lifting a 200-pound man by herself. Because no one came when she rang for help. She was taken to the emergency room of the same hospital, put on a gurney in a hallway, and left there. 6 hours. When a doctor finally saw her, the clot had already done its work. She died in a corridor, on a shelf, treated exactly the way she had spent her whole life refusing to treat anyone else. Odessa was 15. She sat in that hallway, and she made her mother a promise. She did not know yet what shape it would take. She only knew the shape of the wound. She got a nursing license in 1979, one of the first black women in her class in the whole state. She worked the floors for a decade, and she watched the same machine grind. in 100 different buildings. The good wing and the forgotten wing. The residents who got called by their names and the residents who got called the difficult one. The feeder. The do not resuscitate in room 12. She saw who got left by the doors. She always saw who got left by the doors. In 1991, she took out a second mortgage on a house she could not afford to lose. Bought a shuttered boarding house on the edge of Charlotte and opened it as a home for 8 old people that the fancy places had turned away. She called it Meridian because a meridian is the highest point the sun reaches in a day, and she decided that every person under her roof, on their worst day, in their last year, would be treated like they were standing at the top of the sky. 8 beds became 16. 16 became a second house. By 2005, there were 9 communities. By 2015, 28. By the time this story starts, Meridian Senior Living was 40 communities, 4,000 beds, 11,000 employees, and Odessa Grant, founder, chairman, and holder of the controlling shares, was worth more money than the mill. Her father died believing was the top of the mountain. But here is the thing about building an empire. You cannot be in 40 buildings at once. You hire people. You trust the org chart. You read the reports they send you. And the reports say occupancy is up. Margins are healthy. Satisfaction scores are strong. And the numbers glow. And you start to believe the numbers. And you forget the one thing your mother taught you on the colored floor. The truth is never in the front lobby. The truth is always in the wing they don't show the families. Odessa had gotten comfortable. She admitted that to herself later. She had let herself believe the marble, and then a letter reached her desk that the org chart had tried very hard to make sure she would never see. It came through the corporate ethics line, the anonymous one printed on the back of every break room poster, the one Grayson Pruitt privately called the wine hotline. It had been filed 5 months earlier by a 19-year-old nursing aide at the flagship community, Meridian Crest, in Ballantyne. It had been routed to the regional office, reviewed by a regional director who golfed with Grayson twice a month. Marked, unsubstantiated interpersonal conflict. And buried, but the ethics vendor kept an archive and a new compliance auditor, doing a routine sweep, had flagged the buried file, and not knowing any better, thank God, forwarded it up the chain, all the way up, to a private inbox almost no one had the address for. Odessa read it at 11 o'clock at night, at her kitchen table. Alone. It was 2 pages, handwritten first, then typed by the hotline operator. It described a resident named Ruth Mayfield. Everyone called her Ms. Ruthie, a 79-year-old woman in the North Hall wing of Meridian Crest. It described call lights ignored for hours, meals charted as consumed that were never brought, a pressure sore that grew for weeks because no one turned her, then got infected. Because turning the North Hall people was not a priority when the pavilion families were touring, it described Ms. Ruthie begging, at the end, for someone to just sit with her. It described the aide sitting with her, on an unpaid break, because no one else would. It described Ms. Ruthie dying, alone, except for a 19-year-old girl holding her hand, off the clock. And it described a system. This isn't one mistake. The letter said, it's how the building is run. There is a list, the residents who can't pay premium, the residents with no family who visits, they get less on purpose. And when you say something, they cut your hours until you quit. I'm not the first person to write this. I'll probably get fired for writing it, but somebody has to see them. If nobody sees them, they die twice. Odessa Grant read that last line, and the coffee cup in her hand began, very slightly, to shake. Somebody has to see them. If nobody sees them, they die twice. Those were her mother's words. This girl had never met her mother. This girl was 19 years old. At the bottom of the org chart, making $13 an hour on the exact same kind of floor Ruth Ann Grant had died on. 50 years before, the colored floor, remodeled and rebranded, and moved south, and hung with a nicer sign. But the same floor, the same machine, in her building, unter Hername, wearing her mother's promise like a costume while it did the opposite of everything she had bled to build. The letter was signed with 2 initials. N. F. Odessa did not call the regional office. She did not call Grayson Pruitt. She did not send a corporate inspection team in their matching polos, the kind of inspection every executive director in the country can smell coming a week away and clean up for. She went to her closet, and she took down a plain gray uniform. She called a staffing agency. Her own general counsel had quietly set up as a shell company 3 years earlier for exactly this. Though she'd never used it, and she registered as a temporary resident life aide named Odessa G. She put her mother's old laminated badge in her pocket, and on a Monday morning, the woman who owned every bed in the building walked in through the service entrance of Meridian Crest, clocked in at $13.10 an hour, and went to see for herself who was getting left by the doors. She gave herself 2 weeks. She would not need them. Meridian Crest was 2 buildings pretending to be one. The front half was the Palmetto Pavilion, 18 months old, financed as a luxury memory care expansion, marketed at $11,000 a month, wide blank floors, a bistro with a mocktail bar, a movie room, a salon, a wellness concierge, 12 suites, each one bigger than the house Odessa grew up in. The families who toured the pavilion wore good watches and asked good questions, and Grayson Pruitt met every one of them personally. In a charcoal suit, with a leather folio and a smile that had closed 1,000 deals. Then you walked through a set of double doors marked staff only, down a corridor that smelled like industrial cleaner, failing to cover something older. And you were in North Hall. North Hall was the original building. 41 residents, 2 hallways of rooms, 2 beds each, a curtain between them, 1 shared bathroom for 4. The paint was the color of weak tea. Half the overhead lights buzzed and flickered. The air handler pushed warm, stale air in July, and nothing in January. There was a day room with a television bolted too high on the wall, tuned to a channel nobody had chosen, and a dozen residents parked in a semicircle in front of it, facing it, not watching it, because no one had the time to do anything with them but park them. 38 of the 41 North Hall residents were on Medicaid, or the low end of the pay scale. 31 of the 41 were black. Odessa stood in the doorway of North Hall on her first morning, in her gray scrubs, and she understood the entire business model in 90 seconds. The pavilion was the storefront. North Hall was the engine. You collected the Medicaid dollars for 41 bodies. You spent as little as humanly possible, keeping those bodies alive. And you funneled the surplus into marble and lilies, to sell 12 luxury suites at a markup that made the whole operation glow on a spreadsheet. The neglect wasn't a failure of the system. The neglect was the system. North Hall was designed to be cheap, and cheap meant invisible, and invisible meant nobody turned Ms. Ruthie and Ms. Ruthie died twice. She had built a company to kill this exact machine, and here it was, wearing her name, running at full speed. She kept her face still, and she went to work. The first person who was kind to her was the last person in that building with any power to be. His name was Earl Dawes, 61 years old, a maintenance man who'd been at Crest longer than the marble had. And he found her trying to figure out the broken supply closet on the North Hall side. Trictoit, Earl said, coming up beside her. He lifted the door on its hinge, and it swung free. Whole wings held together with tricks. They'll spend $40,000 on a chandelier for the front, and won't buy me a $2 hinge for the back. He looked at her badge. You knew. Or agency knew. Agency. Odessa said. Odessa. Earl. He studied her a second. Longer than a maintenance man. Usually studies a temp. You seem like you've been around old folks before. My whole life. Then I'm sorry. Earl said. 'Cause you're gonna hate it here. And he told her, in the flat voice of a man who'd stopped expecting anyone to fix anything, how it worked. He didn't call it a system. He didn't have to. The second person she met was the reason she'd come. Nia Foster was 5'2", 20 years old, box braids pulled back under a scrub cap, and dark circles under her eyes that no 20-year-old should have. Odessa found her at 7:40 in the morning, in North Hall, room 114, feeding a resident named Mr. Plast Boyd a cup of applesauce, one careful spoonful at a time, talking to him low and steady the whole while. And Odessa noticed, immediately, that Nia was doing it on her own break, because her assignment sheet had her clocked to the pavilion that morning. And she had come to North Hall anyway. You have to go slow with Mr. Boyd, Nia said, not looking up, assuming Odessa was there to help. He forgets to swallow if you rush him. And don't stand behind him. It scares him. He was a soldier. He doesn't like people behind him. He can't see. She glanced up then, saw the temp badge, sized up in 1 second whether Odessa was going to be useful, or just another warm body to cover for. You're the new agency one. You any good? Or am I doing your rooms too today? Odessa looked at the girl, 19, when she wrote the letter, 20 now, bone-tired, and still coming in on her break to feed a dying man applesauce so he wouldn't go the way Miss Ruthie went. N.F. Nia Foster. I'm good. Odessa said quietly. Show me how you do it. I'll learn your way. Something flickered across Nia's face. Surprise. Mostly. In that building, nobody asked to learn her way. She was the bottom of the bottom. Odessa filed that flicker away and picked up a spoon and did it Nia's way. Slow. In front of him, talking low, Mr. Cornelius Boyd was 84 years old. He had taught high school history for 39 years. In a town 2 counties over the place. He had a bronze star from Korea in a drawer. Nobody had opened in a year. He had early-stage Alzheimer's, which meant he lost the thread of the present constantly, but could still, on a good morning, recite the Gettysburg Address from memory and tell you the name of every man in his platoon. He had one daughter, in Seattle, who called on Sundays and could not afford to visit, which meant, in the arithmetic of Meridian Crest, that Mr. Boyd was a low-priority resident with no family presence, and that put him on a list. They actually had a list. Odessa found it on day 3. It was not written down as the list. Of course, it was a color-coded census. In the nursing office, a laminated grid on the wall, updated in dry erase marker, that Sloan Whitaker, the director of nursing, used to run the floor. Green residents were priority, the pavilion suites, the private pay families, the ones with relatives who visited and asked questions and might post a review. Green residents got charted first. Checked first. Turned on schedule. Walked to the bistro. Blue residents were standard, and the residents marked with a small gray dot in the corner of their square Odessa counted 26 of them. Every single one in North Hall were, in the private language of the nursing office, efficiency residents. Efficiency. That was the word. It meant the minimum required to avoid a citation. It meant 1 aide for the whole North Hall day room, while 3 aides floated the pavilion. It meant call lights on the North Hall side got answered when someone got to them, and someone got to them last. It meant that if the shift ran short, and the shift always ran short, because Grayson kept North Hall deliberately understaffed to protect the margin, the gray dot residents were the ones who waited. For their meals, for their medication, for a clean bed, for a human face. Ms. Ruthie had had a gray dot. Odessa stood in front of that laminated grid on day 3, in her temp scrubs, with a stack of clean linens in her arms and her mother's badge in her pocket. And she read her own company's machinery for sorting human beings into seen and unseen. And she had to walk into the supply closet and stand in the dark for a full minute before her hands would stop. Then she came out, and she started building a case. She did not confront anyone. That was the whole discipline of it. She had learned over 50 years. That outrage is a torch, bright, satisfying, and gone in an instant, leaving nothing but ash and a fired temp. Evidence is a foundation. You lay it quietly. Brick be brick. And one day you build the whole courthouse on top of the people who never saw you carrying stones. So Odessa carried stones. She worked her assigned rooms flawlessly, better than flawlessly. Because 50 years ago, she had been the best aide on any floor she ever stood on. And the body remembers. And in between, she watched. And she wrote, not in a leather journal, in the notes on a cheap second phone. In a private log her general counsel had set up, time-stamped and backed up to a server. The moment she typed each line, room numbers, times, names, the call light in room 118 that rang for 51 minutes on Tuesday while 2 aides were pulled to set up the Pavilion Bistro for a tour, the medication cart that skipped North Hall's afternoon pass entirely on Wednesday, because Sloan sent the med tech to float front. The lunch trays charted, consumed in the electronic record for 4 gray dot residents on Thursday. Trays Odessa personally watched sit, cold and untouched, on a cart in the hallway, because the aide assigned had been floated and no one replaced her. And then the trays were dumped and charted as eaten, so the numbers would be clean. That last one made Odessa's jaw tighten, because charting a meal that was never given wasn't just cruelty. It was Medicaid fraud. It was a federal crime, committed dozens of times a week. In her building, under her license. To make Grayson Pruitt's margins glow, she photographed the census grid. She photographed the assignment sheets that showed the deliberate North Hall shortfalls. She quietly used the login the agency had been given a real, working, low-level login, because temps needed to chart too. And she pulled her own read-only glimpses of the falsified meal records. And her legal team pulled the rest through channels Grayson didn't know were watching. And every night she went back to the small apartment she'd rented under the name Odessa. And she laid the day's bricks in a row. And she thought about her mother in the hallway. And she did not sleep much. Grayson Pruitt did not run Meridian Crest alone. No rot this deep is ever one man. It is a circle, and the circle protects itself. And everyone in it has a reason to keep the machine running. There was Sloan Whitaker, 44, director of nursing, the one who kept the laminated grid and floated the aides and decided every shift which human beings were efficiency. Sloan wasn't cruel the way Grayson was cruel. Sloan was worse, in a quieter way. She was a professional who had decided, years ago, that the grid was just resource management, and she had built a wall in her own mind between the dry erase dots and the people dying behind them. She had a nursing license. She had taken an oath. She charted meals she knew weren't served, because Grayson told her the numbers had to be clean. And she told herself it wasn't lying. It was documentation policy. There was Trip Callahan, 36, Director of Community Relations, which meant sales. Trip was charm in a slim-fit suit. Trip gave the tours. Trip walked the good families through the pavilion, past the mocktail bar. And if a family ever asked to see the other wing, Trip had 6 different graceful ways to make sure they never did. Trip's entire job was to make sure the people writing the checks never, ever saw North Hall. He was very, very good at his job. There was Wade Brunner, 51, business office manager. He handled the billing, and he handled something else. Many North Hall residents had small personal needs accounts. The modest trust funds, where a resident's Social Security spending money sat $40 here, $60 there, for haircuts, snacks, a birthday card. Residents with attentive families had families who checked those accounts. Residents with gray dots, no visitors. Failing memory, had nobody checking, and over the years, in amounts small enough to never trip an audit, Wade Brunner had been draining them. A supply fee here, a processing charge there. Ms. Ruthie's account had been emptied to 0 the month before she died. She'd asked, in her last weeks, if she had enough left for a new nightgown. There was no record that anyone ever answered her. And there was Roy Deacon, 48, Director of Environmental Services and Security. The muscle. Roy controlled the cameras. Roy controlled the badge access. Roy was the one who handled staff who became a problem. And Roy was the one who, when a complaint got filed, made sure the relevant footage got overwritten in the normal 30-day cycle a few days early. Roy called the North Hall residents the inventory. He thought it was funny. That was the circle. And the circle had a way of dealing with anyone at the bottom who saw too much and said too much. They cut your hours until you starved out. Odessa watched them do it to Nia in real time. It started 3 days after Odessa arrived. And it started because Nia would not stop advocating. It was simply not in the girl to walk past a ringing call light. On a Thursday, Nia found a gray dot resident, Mr. Okafor, sitting in a soiled bed at 11 in the morning, because his morning care had been skipped when his aide got floated. Nia cleaned him, changed the linens, made him comfortable, and then, this was her mistake. In the logic of that building, she wrote it up, a formal incident report, second one that month. By that afternoon, Sloan Whitaker had called Nia into the nursing office and written her up for clocking in unassigned areas, for insubordination repeatedly leaving assigned pavilion duties, for creating conflict. Aggressive. Sloan used that word in the write-up. Nia has an aggressive communication style with leadership. A 20-year-old girl who weighed $115 soaking wet, who came in on her breaks to feed a dying man applesauce, was written up as aggressive for the crime of noticing that people were suffering. Odessa knew that word. She had had that word thrown at her for 50 years. Aggressive. It is the word institutions use when a black person refuses to be comfortable with cruelty. It is the word that turns a moral objection into a personality flaw. She heard Sloan use it. Through the office door, she was pretending to mop outside of and something very old and very cold settled in her chest. The next week, Nia's hours got cut, 36 down to 22. Then the schedule just happened to give her the worst possible shifts. A closing shift followed 9 hours later by an opening shift. Over and over. The kind of scheduling that isn't against the rules, but is designed to break a body until it quits on its own. So, no one ever has to fire anybody, and no one ever has to file anything. 3 nursing aides had quit North Hall in the last 8 months, under exactly that treatment. No terminations. No complaints. Just gone. The same clean disappearance Odessa had read about 100 times. In 100 exit interview reports that had crossed her desk marked voluntary separation, pursuing other opportunities. She had believed those reports. She had glanced at the turnover numbers and thought, care work is hard. High turnover is normal. She had let the paper lie to her. She would never let paper lie to her again. Now I want you to sit in something for a second, because it would be easy to watch this and think it's just one bad building, with one bad boss. It isn't. Think about how it actually worked. A 19-year-old girl saw an old woman dying of neglect. She did the bravest, the most correct thing a person can do. She wrote it down and reported it. Through the exact official channel they printed on the break room poster and told her to use. And that report climbed the ladder to a regional director who golfed with the man it accused. And it got stamped unsubstantiated. And it got buried. And the reward for her courage was that they started quietly starving her out of a job, while the man who ran the machine got a bonus for operational efficiency. That is not a broken system. A broken system is one that is trying to work and failing. This one was working perfectly. It did exactly what it was built to do. Protect the people at the top, grind up the people at the bottom, and make sure nobody with money ever had to see it. And the only reason it ever got interrupted is that, by pure chance, one letter slipped past one golf buddy and landed on the desk of the one person in the whole country who owned the building, and remembered what it felt like to be the girl at the bottom. That is not justice. That is a lottery ticket. Ask yourself how many Ms. Soar Ruthies never got the lottery ticket. Ask yourself, how many are in a North Hall right now? Gray dot in the corner of a grid, waiting on a call light. Nobody is going to answer. Now hold on to that feeling, because Odessa held on to it too. She started spending her breaks in room 114 with Mr. Boyd. She told herself it was strategy that a man who taught history for 39 years, even one losing his grip on the present, might be a witness worth having. And that was true, but it was not the whole truth. The whole truth was that Cornelius Boyd reminded her of her father. The same big, careful hands, the same dignity that didn't need an audience, the same way of going quiet and looking at the middle distance when the past got closer than the present. On his clear mornings, Mr. Boyd talked. He told Odessa about his classroom, about the year they integrated his school, and the things white parents said to him in the parking lot, and how he taught anyway. 39 years. Because somebody had to show those children the whole country, not just the parts that flattered it. He recited the preamble to the Constitution and got wistful at a more perfect union. More perfect. He'd say, tapping the arm of his chair, means we admitted, right there at the start, that we hadn't done it yet. That's the assignment. Young lady, that's the whole assignment. He called her young lady. He was 84, and she was 68. And it made her want to weep every single time. On his bad mornings, he was frightened. He'd wake, not knowing where he was. And if an aide came at him fast, or stood behind him where he couldn't see, he'd panic, because part of him was 22 again. and somewhere cold and dangerous. And when Mr. Boyd panicked, the machine had an answer for that too. They medicated him. Odessa found it in the chart. An as-needed sedative order, and a pattern of as-needed that lined up, not with Mr. Boyd's distress, but with the staff's convenience. He got dosed heaviest on tour days, on short staff days, on the days when a confused old man asking for help was inconvenient to the story Trip Callahan was selling in the lobby. They weren't treating his fear. They were treating their own inconvenience by turning a human being down like a thermostat. It's called a chemical restraint, and it is illegal. And it is one of the most common quiet cruelties in the entire industry. And it was happening to Cornelius Boyd, Bronze Star, 39 years in a classroom, because it was cheaper than sitting with him. Odessa watched them dose him on a Tuesday, watched Sloan sign off on it 15 minutes before a pavilion tour, watched the light go out of the old man's eyes an hour later, watched him slump in his chair in the day room, drooling slightly, parked in front of the too-high television, and she photographed the chart, and the clock, and the tour schedule, and she added 3 more bricks to the foundation. And then she went and sat with him anyway, and held his big, careful hand, while he slept, the sleep they'd forced on him. And she said, very quietly, so no one else could hear, "I see you, Mr. Boyd. I promise you. Somebody sees you now." He didn't wake up, but his hand closed around hers. Nia caught her crying in the supply closet on the second Friday. Odessa hadn't heard the door. She was standing in the dark with her mother's badge in her hand. Ruth Ann Grant. Aide. County home. 1971. And the tears had come up out of nowhere. 50 years of them. And Nia opened the door for a mop and found the strange, calm temp aide standing there, weeping over a piece of laminated cardboard. Nia didn't leave. That told Odessa everything about the girl. Nia stepped in and closed the door and stood with her in the dark. The way you stand with someone at a funeral. You knew somebody who was in a place like this. Nia said. It wasn't a question. My mother, Odessa, said. A long time ago. She worked in one. It killed her. Close enough to true. Nia nodded slowly. I keep telling myself I'm gonna quit, she said, and her voice cracked on it. Everybody says quit. My mama says quit. It's just a job. It's not worth your health. And I keep not doing it. 'Cause if I leave, who feeds Mr. Comes? Boyd Slow, who checks room 118's light they gave Ms. Ruthie a gray dot and let her rot. And I was the only one who... She stopped, wiped her face hard with the heel of her hand. I wrote it up. Did you know you can write it up? There's a hotline. I called it. I did everything right. She laughed, and it was the most bitter sound Odessa had ever heard come out of a 20-year-old. You know what happened? Nothing. 5 months. Nothing. Except now Sloan calls me aggressive. And I'm down to 22 hours. And they scheduled me a closing then opening 3 days running. That's what happens when you do everything right in here. Nothing happens to them. Everything happens to you. Odessa Grant stood in that closet, in her $13 an hour scrubs, and looked at the 19-year-old whistleblower, who had grown into a 20-year-old they were burying alive. And she made the second promise of her life. The first promise she had made in a hospital hallway. To her dying mother. She had kept it for 50 years and built 40 buildings on it, and then let it get corrupted while she wasn't looking. The second promise she made now, silently, to Nia Foster. You did everything right, and I am going to make sure that this time, everything happens to them. Don't quit yet. Odessa said, 2 more weeks. Can you give it 2 more weeks? Naya looked at her like she was crazy. Why? Because, Odessa said, I have a feeling this place is about to change. Nia laughed again. Softer this time. The laugh of someone who has stopped believing in change, but is too kind to say so to a stranger's face. Yeah, she said. Okay. Ms. Odessa. Sure it is. She had no idea. None of them did. But the woman standing in that closet had already made one phone call the night before to a man named David Okonkwo, her general counsel. The only person alive who knew where Odessa G actually was, and she had told him 3 words. Assemble the team. Here is the part Grayson Pruitt built himself. Every villain in a story like this eventually builds his own stage. Grayson built a gala. It had been on the calendar for months, long before Odessa ever walked in the service door. Meridian Senior Living was turning 30 that year, and corporate had asked each flagship community to host a Founders Day celebration, a nod to the reclusive woman who'd started it all. In a boarding house. In 1991. For Grayson, Founders Day was not a tribute. It was an opportunity. He was angling for the open regional vice president seat, and he intended to use the gala to prove that Meridian Crest, his crest, was the crown jewel of the entire network. So he spent money. Not on North Hall. God. No. On the show, he rented a string quartet. He had the Palmetto Pavilion draped in white and gold. He invited the mayor, who sent a deputy. He invited a state senator named Hollis, who actually came. Because Grayson had donated to his campaign, he invited the regional director, his golf partner, the man who'd buried Nia's complaint, and 2 corporate executives, flying in from the home office. He invited the good families, the pavilion families, the ones with watches. He invited a features reporter from the Charlotte Metro desk, and a photographer. Because a glowing profile of Meridian Crest, with a state senator in the frame, was exactly the kind of thing that got a man made regional vice president. He did not invite a single North Hall family. He scheduled the gala for a Saturday evening, and he quietly arranged for North Hall's residents to be settled early dinner, served at 4:30 am. Medications passed. The wing dimmed and closed off behind the staff-only doors by 6 p.m. A full 2 hours before the first guest arrived, so that not one gray dot resident, not one buzzing light, not one piece of reality would leak into the party. He was. In other words, I'm going to throw a celebration of Odessa Grant's life's work by hiding everyone that life's work was supposed to be for. He was going to toast the founder. In a room built out of the exact betrayal of everything she founded, Odessa learned the plan the way she learned everything quietly. On the floor. In the 2 weeks she'd given herself. And she called David Okonkwo that night. And she made a decision that changed 40 buildings. The gala, she said, that's where we do it. Odessa. David had been her lawyer for 19 years. He was allowed to argue with her. And he did. We have enough right now for the state. We have the falsified meal records, the trust account theft, the chemical restraint pattern, the retaliation. I can have the Attorney General's Medicaid Fraud Control Unit, and the State Licensing Board, and Adult Protective Services moving on this quietly by Monday. We don't need theater. Theater is a risk. It's not theater. Odessa said. Listen to me. David, if I fire Grayson quietly on a Monday, the machine survives. Corporate does a transition. They blame one bad apple. They slide a new Grayson into the chair, and the grid goes right back up on the wall. North Hall doesn't change because one man got walked out by security on a slow morning. North Hall changes when every executive director in this company in all 40 buildings watches, with their own eyes, in front of the press, in front of a state senator, in front of the whole industry. What happens to a man who builds a gray dot list? It has to be seen. David. That's the whole lesson. If nobody sees it, it dies twice. We are going to make them see it. David was quiet for a long moment. Then you know what you're doing to yourself. You spent 30 years staying out of the press. Reclusive founder. No photos. No interviews. After Saturday, you're a headline forever. I know. There's no going back to invisible image. David, Odessa said softly, I've been invisible for 2 weeks. In a gray uniform. I've never in my life understood so clearly what it costs. The people who don't get to take the uniform off. I'm done being invisible. Bring the team Saturday. Bring the documents. And David, bring the badge from my safe deposit box. My mother's real one. The original. Saturday came, by 7 that evening. The Palmetto Pavilion glowed like a jewel box. The string quartet played. Waiters passed champagne. State Senator Hollis worked the room with his practiced handshake. The 2 corporate executives, a woman named Patrice Lindquist, Executive Vice President of Operations, and a man named Doug Feller. The Chief Financial Officer stood near the podium, making small talk with the regional director. The Charlotte reporter took notes. The photographer took photographs. Grayson Pruitt, in a tuxedo, moved through all of it like a king, through his own coronation. And every family, with a watch, told him what a beautiful, beautiful community he ran, and behind the staff-only doors, 200 feet away, North Hall sat dark, and dimmed, and closed. 41 human beings tucked out of sight, so they wouldn't spoil the party thrown in their founder's name. Odessa was working the gala. Of course she was. Grayson had pulled extra agency temps for the event, cheap labor. Warm bodies. Someone to carry trays and bus glasses and stay invisible in gray while the beautiful people shone. Odessa Grant was one of them. She carried a tray of champagne flutes through the crowd in her gray scrubs, and not one of those elegant people looked at her face. Because that is the great secret superpower of the people we decide don't matter. They can stand 3 feet from you, holding your drink, and you will never once see them. She was watching for her moment, and Grayson Pruitt, God bless him, handed it to her on a silver tray. It was almost 8. Grayson was near the podium with the 2 corporate executives and the senator, and a woman in the crowd said, loudly, delighted, "Oh, is this where the founder started, Miss Grant? Is she here tonight? I'd so love to meet her. My mother's in the pavilion. We just think the world of this place." And Grayson Pruitt, smooth, charming, at the absolute peak of his performance, laughed and said, "Odessa Grant, oh. No, nobody's seen her in years. Between us, I'm not entirely sure. She's still with us." A ripple of polite laughter. "But I like to think she'd be proud of what we've built here." This he gestured grandly at the white and gold, the quartet, the champagne. This is her legacy. And that was the moment Odessa set down her tray. She was standing 8 feet from him when she did it. She set the tray on a side table, and she took off the flimsy agency lanyard with the Odessa G badge, and she dropped it on the tray, and into the pocket of her gray scrubs she reached. And she took out a second badge, an old one, laminated cardboard, soft with age, and she held it in her fist. And she took 1 step toward the podium. And she said, in a voice that 50 years of running floors and boardrooms had made carry, without ever being raised. I'm still with you. Grayson, I'm right here. The woman turned. The senator turned. Grayson turned. Annoyed. An agency temp had spoken, had inserted herself into a conversation with important people, and he opened his mouth to have Roy Deacon remove her. Get her out of my name, Odessa said. And now she was walking, slow and steady, straight at him, through a crowd that was going quiet in a spreading ring. Is Odessa Mary Grant? I was born in Gary, Indiana, in 1957. In 1991, I mortgaged my house and bought a boarding house and put 8 old people in it that places like this one had thrown away. And I have spent 30 years, and every dollar I own, building a company that I named Meridian. She was 10 feet away now, then 8, because a meridian is the highest point the sun reaches in a day. And I decided that every soul under my roof, on their worst day, they would be treated like they were standing at the top of the sky. The room had gone silent. The quartet had stopped mid-phrase. Grayson Pruitt's charming face had frozen into something that wasn't sure yet whether to laugh. That's a nice story, he said, and his voice had a thin crack in it. A hairline. The first one. But you're an agency. Doug. Odessa didn't look at Grayson. She looked past him, at the chief financial officer, Doe fella, who had gone the color of paper. Doe fella, you've seen my signature on a board resolution every quarter for 6 years. Look at my face. You've seen it in the private file. Say my name. Doug Feller looked at the 68-year-old woman in gray scrubs, holding a piece of laminated cardboard, and every drop of blood left his face. And he said so quietly that the whole silent room heard it. Miss Grant, say it louder. Doug, the senator can't hear you. Oh my God, said Patrice Lindquist, the executive vice president, one hand rising to her mouth. Oh my God, it's hair, Doug Feller said. Louder. To the room. To Grayson. To the state senator. To the photographer whose camera had started firing. That's Grayson. That's Odessa Grant. That's the founder. That's the owner. And Grayson Pruitt, executive director of Meridian Crest, in his rented tuxedo, in the ballroom he'd built out of everyone he'd hidden, looked at the temp aide he had called charity trash in front of his whole staff, the warm body he'd said he could unrent with one phone call, the cheapest labor in the building, and he understood, at last, exactly whose ground he had been standing on. His champagne flute slipped out of his hand and shattered on the imported floor. Nobody moved to clean it up. For a moment, nobody spoke. A string quartet frozen with their bows in the air. A senator with his champagne halfway to his mouth. A photographer firing frame after frame after frame. And a room full of wealthy families slowly turning to stare at the woman in gray scrubs who had, 30 seconds ago, I've been invisible. Odessa let the silence do its work. She had learned that from her mother, too. When you finally have the room's whole attention, you do not rush. You make them lean in. 2 weeks ago, she said, and she turned now, slowly, so the whole room could hear. I came into this building through the service entrance. I clocked in as a temporary aide named Dessa, at $13.10 an hour. I did that because a letter reached my desk that this company's leadership tried very hard to make sure I would never read. It was written by a 19-year-old girl on my North Hall staff. It described a resident named Ruth Mayfield, a 79-year-old woman, a mother, a grandmother who died in my building, of a pressure sore that grew for weeks because nobody turned her. while she begged for someone to sit with her. Because on the list this building keeps, she was marked as efficiency. The word landed in the silent room like a stone in still water. There is a list. Odessa said. It hangs on the wall of the nursing office. It sorts the human beings in this building by how much they can pay and how likely their families are to complain. And the people at the bottom of that list, the poor ones, and I will say the true thing, the mostly black ones are given, on purpose, less, fewer aides, later medication, meals that are charted as eaten and then thrown in the trash uneaten. So the numbers stay clean. That last one is not just cruelty. Senator Hollis, she turned to the state senator, who had set his glass down, charting a federal meal benefit as delivered when it was not, is Medicaid fraud. It has happened dozens of times a week in this building. For years, I have the records. I have the timestamps. And in about 90 seconds, so will the Attorney General. She raised her hand, a small gesture, and the double doors at the back of the pavilion opened. 6 people walked in. They were not in tuxedos. They were in suits. And 2 of them wore the kind of badge clipped to a belt that changes the temperature of a room the instant people register it. David Okonkwo led them, tall, unhurried, a leather folio under his arm. Behind him came 2 attorneys from the State Attorney General's office, an investigator from Adult Protective Services, and a woman from the State Licensing Board. They had been waiting in a van in the parking lot since 7:45. This is David Okonkwo, my general counsel, Odessa said. The people behind him are from the State Medicaid Fraud Control Unit, Adult Protective Services, and the Licensing Board. They have copies of everything I gathered over the last 2 weeks, cross-referenced with records. My legal team pulled through proper channels, falsified meal records, trust account withdrawals from residents who had no family checking Mr. Pan's. End quote. Brunner, that's you. And I'd stop reaching for your phone if I were you. A pattern of chemical restraint, used not to treat frightened residents, but to make them convenient, and a retaliation scheme that has quietly driven out every staff member who ever tried to report any of it. She turned then, and she found Grayson Pruitt's eyes. And for the first time all night, her voice dropped low, and private, and terrible the way a cruel man's voice drops in a storage room to threaten someone weaker. Except this was the exact reverse of that. This was the person with all the power in the world choosing how to use it. You called me charity trash, Grayson, in your lobby, in front of your staff. You told me people like me are the reason you have a service entrance. She let that sit. I have spent every day of my life since I was 15 years old fighting the idea you said out loud in your marble lobby like it was the weather. You didn't just neglect my residents. You took the one thing I built this entire company to give them the right to be treated like a human being without earning it first, and you turned it into a pricing tier. Grayson's lawyer instinct kicked in, and he tried. He actually tried. Ms. Grant, Odessa, there's context. These are complex operational, the margins in this industry. You know the margins. I was hitting the targets corporate set. Doug. Odessa did not take her eyes off Grayson. Patrice. Were the targets you set for this building? Starve the North Hall wing and skim the residents' spending money? No. Patrice Lindquist said immediately, her voice shaking. God. No. Ms. Grant. We had no idea. The numbers he reported were clean. Odessa said, because he made them clean by throwing lunches in the garbage. She finally looked away from Grayson, at the 2 corporate executives, at the regional director, trying very hard to disappear into the wall, and Marcus, the regional director, flinched at his own name. You had this exact report 5 months ago. From the same girl. You marked it unsubstantiated. And you buried it. And then you came to a party. We'll talk. Oh, we'll talk. Then Odessa Grant did the thing that Grayson Pruitt had spent good money and 2 hours of careful scheduling to prevent. She walked to the back of the pavilion, to the double doors marked staff. Only the doors that separated the marble from the machine, the party from the people, and she pushed them open, both of them, wide, and she propped them, and she turned back to the room full of senators, and executives, and reporters, and wealthy families. And she said, "You came to celebrate what I built. Then come see it. All of it. Not just the part they let you see." And she led the whole gala. The senator, the chief financial officer, the reporter, the photographer, the families with the watches through the staff. Only doors. Down the corridor that smelled of cleaner failing to hide something older. Into North Hall, into the dimmed, closed-off wing, where 41 human beings had been tucked out of sight so they wouldn't spoil the party. The tea-colored walls, the flickering lights Roy Deacon had never fixed. The day room with the television bolted too high, and the residents the gray dots. The inventory, the charity trash, sitting in the dark, where they'd been parked at 6 p.m. and left, because there weren't enough aides, because there were never enough aides, because being invisible was the entire point. The photographer stopped taking pictures. The woman who'd asked about the founder put her hand over her mouth. The state senator walked slowly down the North Hall corridor in his good suit and did not say one word. And in the doorway of room 114, in the dark, sat a 20-year-old girl named Nia Foster, off the clock again, on her own time again, feeding an 84-year-old man named Cornelius Boyd a cup of applesauce, one careful spoonful at a time, in front of him where he could see her, talking to him low and steady, because it was 8 o'clock on a Saturday night, and she was the only person in that whole glittering building who had come to make sure he ate. Odessa Grant stopped in that doorway, and for the second time in 2 weeks, the woman who owned every bed in the building wept. But this time she did not hide it. And this time it was in front of everyone, a state senator, and a chief financial officer, and a newspaper photographer. And she did not care, because some things are meant to be seen. "Yeah," she said. Nia looked up, exhausted, confused, taking in the crowd of tuxedos filling the North Hall corridor, taking in the strange, calm temp aide, standing in front of them all, in her gray scrubs, with tears running down her face. "Ms. Desania said, What's going on? My name isn't Dessa," Odessa said, and she crossed the room, and she knelt down beside the wheelchair beside Nia, beside Mr. Boyd at the bottom of the org chart, on the floor, where her mother had lived and died. "My name is Odessa Grant. I own this company. I own every building. And I read your letter. Baby." Her voice broke clean in half. "I read your letter. You did everything right. You did everything right. And I am so sorry that for 5 months, nobody who was supposed to see you. But I see you now. Do you hear me? I see you now. And so does everybody standing in this hallway." Nia Foster looked at the founder of Meridian Senior Living, kneeling on the floor of North Hall in a $13 an hour uniform. And she did not have any words. She just started to cry. And Mr. Boyd, Cornelius Boyd, Bronze Star, the 39 years in a classroom, gray dot in the corner of a grid, looked around the room at all the people who had finally come, and on some deep current, below the fog of everything he'd lost. He understood that something had shifted. He reached out one big, careful hand, and he patted Odessa on the shoulder, the way a teacher pats a student who has finally gotten the answer right. And he said the last complete sentence anyone would hear him say clearly for a long time. "There now," said Mr. Voigt. "That's the assignment. More perfect. See, I told you. That's the whole assignment." Justice did not wait for Monday. Odessa Grant made sure of that. She had learned, over 50 years, that the machine survives on delay, on will review it, on pending investigation, on the slow bleed of time that lets outrage cool and lets the guilty rehearse. So she did it right there, in the North Hall corridor, in front of the state, and the press, and the whole frozen gala. "Grayson Pruitt," she said, rising from the floor, wiping her face, her voice level again, and hard as rebar. "You are terminated, effective this second. Your corporate credentials are revoked. Your building access is revoked. And Roy Deacon will not be escorting you out. Because Roy Deacon is terminated too. David has your separation documented and witnessed. You will not set foot in a Meridian community again, as long as I own it. And I will own it until I die." Grayson opened his mouth. His lawyer put a hand on his arm. This time, Grayson let him. "Sloan Whitaker." Odessa turned to the director of nursing, who had followed the crowd through the doors and now stood white-faced against the tea-colored wall. "You kept that list. You floated the aides. You signed off on chemical restraints for staff convenience. And you charted meals you knew weren't served. You have a nursing license and an oath. And you traded both for a clean spreadsheet. You're terminated. And your conduct is being referred to the State Board of Nursing tonight. What they do with your license is up to them. But you will never sort another human being into efficiency on my watch." Wade Brunner, the business office manager, was already edging toward the exit. Two of David's people were already, quietly, between him and it. "You drained the personal accounts of residents who had no one to check for them. You took Ms. Ruthie's spending money the month before she died, begging for a nightgown. That is not a policy dispute. Mr. Brunner, that is theft from incapacitated elders. It is a crime, and these people," she nodded at the Attorney General's investigators, "are going to want a very long conversation with you." Terminated. Referred for prosecution. Trip Callahan, the salesman, for once, had nothing charming to say. Your entire job was making sure nobody with money ever saw this hallway. You were the door on the machine. Terminated. And Marcus, the regional director, the golf partner, the man who buried a 19-year-old's cry for help under one word. You're relieved of your position. Effective now. Pending a full review of every complaint that ever crossed your desk. From every building in your region. Because I promise you, Marcus, if you buried one, you buried others. And we are going to dig up every single one. Then she turned to the two corporate executives, Patrice Lindquist and Doug Feller, and the room braced. Because they wore the same title as the rest of the leadership. Patrice. Doug, you didn't build this, but you believed the numbers. You saw the turnover reports, and the margin reports, and the satisfaction scores, and they glowed. And you didn't ask why one building's margins were so much better than all the others. Neither did I. That's the part I have to own. We got comfortable with paper, and paper lies. And while we were reading it, People were dying in the dark, 200 feet from our celebration. She looked at them both. Hard, you're not fired. You're on notice. Because starting Monday, the two of you are going to help me tear this machine out by the roots. In all 40 buildings. And if either one of you flinches once, you'll wish I had fired you tonight. Patrice Lindquist straightened her spine and said, Yes, ma'am, we won't flinch. And Dow Feller, still the color of paper, nodded and meant it. That was the reckoning for the people. But Odessa Grant had told David Okonkwo the truth in that phone call. If you punish one man, the machine survives. So she did not stop at people. She went after the machine itself. She stayed at Meridian Crest. Not for a day. For 2 months. The billionaire founder moved into an extended stay hotel in Ballantyne. And she came to the building every morning at 6. And she rebuilt North Hall with her own hands. And her own checkbook. And her own 50 years of knowing exactly how a place like this is supposed to run. The list came down. Odessa took the laminated census grid off the nursing office wall herself. And she broke it in half. And she instituted a rule, so simple it should never have needed. Instituting every resident gets charted, checked, medicated, and cared for on the same schedule. And staffing is set by the number of residents in the wing, not by the number of dollars in the wing. North Hall's staffing was tripled overnight. The flickering lights got fixed the first week. Earl Dawes finally got more than a $2 hinge. He got a budget, and a title, and a raise. The air handler got replaced. The double doors marked staff only came off their hinges and went in a dumpster. And the corridor between the pavilion and North Hall became just a hallway. And the residents of both wings started eating in the same bistro, at the same tables. Because there was no longer a front of the building and a back of the building. There was just the building. She created a standard. And she named it, not for herself. She called it the Ruthie Standard for Ruth Mayfield. The woman who died, begging to be turned. And she wrote it into the operating policy of all 40 communities. Under the Ruthie Standard, every family gets real-time digital access to their loved one's care log, so that no meal can ever again be charted as eaten and thrown in the trash. Every community gets an independent resident and family advocate, whose salary is paid by a trust. Odessa Endowed, whose only job is to answer complaints, and who does not report to any executive director and cannot be fired by one. Chemical restraints require independent medical review and family notification every time. No exception. Trust account withdrawals get quarterly outside audits, with statements mailed to a designated advocate for every single resident, especially the ones with no family checking. And the retaliation stops a real, protected, no consequences reporting line, run by that outside trust, that a 19-year-old girl can call and know, that this time, someone at the top will see it, because Odessa built it so that the letters would reach her desk directly, forever. No golf buddy in the middle. She restored every dollar Wade Brunner had stolen, from every resident's account, out of her own pocket, with interest. And she didn't wait for a court to make her. And then there was Nia. Odessa found her in room 114 on the last morning of those 2 months, feeding Mr. Boyd on the clock now, with 3 other aides on the wing, in a hallway with working lights, and she pulled a chair up beside the girl and sat down. "You still thinking about quitting?" Odessa asked. Nia laughed, a real laugh this time, the kind a 20-year-old is supposed to have. "No, Mom." "Good, because I have a different idea." Odessa handed her an envelope. "You did everything right." "Yeah. Back when doing everything right cost you everything. You saw people nobody else would see. That's not a personality flaw. That is the single most valuable thing a person can be in this line of work. And this company treated it like a defect and tried to grind it out of you. So I'm going to do the opposite. Inside that envelope is a full scholarship, nursing school, all of it, books, and living expenses. For as long as it takes. You keep working here part-time if you want the hours. On a schedule you set. And when you're a registered nurse, if you want it, there's a director of nursing chair with your name on it, and not just here. I want you helping me train the Ruthie standard into every building I own, because I don't need nurses who can read a grid. Baby, I've got plenty of those. I need nurses who come in on their break to feed an old man applesauce. Those I can't teach. Those I can only find. And I found you. Nia Foster opened the envelope and read it and could not speak. And Mr. Boyd, who had lost the thread of most things by then, reached over and patted her hand. And Odessa Grant sat in a rebuilt hallway and let herself. At last, I feel something like her mother resting. The story got out. The way stories do now. The Charlotte reporter who'd come to write a puff piece about a state senator at a gala wrote something very different. A front-page investigation. With the photographer's images of a billionaire founder in gray scrubs, kneeling on the floor of a wing her own company had hidden. The photo that went everywhere was that one Odessa on her knees beside a 20-year-old nursing aide and an 84-year-old man. In the dark, in North Hall, the three of them, lit only by a hallway light. Roy Deacon had finally been made to fix. It went national. Of course it did. But here is what mattered. Here is what made it a different kind of viral than a slick clip slowed down frame by frame. People didn't share it to watch someone get taken down. They shared it because 40,000 families in this country have a mother or a father in a building with a front wing and a back wing. And every one of them read that story and got up out of their chair and drove over to check on the wing they'd been told not to worry about. The hashtag wasn't a name and a takedown. It was who is in your North Hall. State legislators in 3 states opened hearings on elder care staffing ratios and meal charting fraud. The industry, which had spent decades hiding its North Halls behind its Palmetto pavilions, spent that whole season very, very nervous. Odessa didn't do a single interview about the takedown. When reporters asked her what it felt like to catch Grayson Pruitt, she gave the same answer every time. I didn't catch anybody. She'd say, I just finally went and looked. That's all any of us have to do. Go look at the wing they don't show you. 1 year later, Meridian Crest didn't have a North Hall anymore. Not because the building changed, because the idea died. There was no gray dot on any grid. Because there was no grid. The bistro was full at lunch, wheelchairs and walkers, pavilion suites, and former North Hall residents, all at the same tables. And a string quartet played there now on Sundays, not for a gala, not for a senator, but for the residents, all of them, because Odessa decided the people at the top of the sky should get the music too. Grayson Pruitt's Medicaid fraud case was working its way through federal court. So was Wade Bruner's indictment for elder financial abuse. Sloan Whitaker had surrendered her nursing license rather than face the board. Roy Deacon had been charged with evidence tampering. For the footage he'd deleted over the years, Trip Callahan had left the industry. Marcus, the regional director, had resigned 2 weeks into the review of his buried complaints. Once it became clear how many there were, none of them ran anything anymore. None of them decided who mattered anymore. Earl Dawes was the director of facilities for the whole Carolina region now, with a real budget and a truck with his name on the door. And Nia Foster was a year into nursing school, top of her class, working weekends at Crest on a schedule she set herself. wearing a badge that said her name and her title, and underneath it, a small line she'd asked Odessa to add to every Meridian badge, in all 40 buildings in memory of a resident, and an Ida, and a promise. It read, "Somebody has to see them." Cornelius Boyd passed away that spring, 85 years old, but he did not die twice. He died in a bright room, with working lights, turned and clean and comfortable, with his daughter flown in from Seattle on a plane ticket. Odessa quietly paid for sitting on one side of the bed, and Nia Foster holding his big, careful hand on the other, and a recording of a choir he'd sung in 60 years before playing low in the room. On his last clear afternoon, a week before, he'd looked at Odessa, and out of the fog, he found one more sentence. "You were the temp," he said, delighted, like he'd solved a puzzle. "The one who sat in front of me. You were the temp the whole time." "I was the temp the whole time," Odessa agreed. "Ha," he laughed. "That big teacher's laugh. Nobody saw you. And you saw everybody." He nodded, satisfied, and drifted. And then, softly, more perfect. "That's the assignment. You keep at it. Young lady, you keep at it." "Yes, Sir," Odessa said. "I'll keep at it." They named the wing after him. Not North Hall. Nobody would ever call it North Hall again. The Cornelius Boyd Memory Care Residence. There's a photograph in the lobby now, right where the marble and the lilies used to be. And it isn't of the founder, because Odessa refused. It's of Mr. Boyd in his classroom in 1974, chalk in his hand, mid-sentence, teaching the whole country to children who'd been told only the flattering parts, and under it, on a small brass plate, there are the 4 words he said to her, the night the doors came open. That's the whole assignment. Odessa Grant still comes to a building every morning at 6. She rotates now, a different community every week. Unannounced, sometimes in a suit, and sometimes, still, in gray scrubs with a temp badge. Because the surest way to know how a place treats the people at the bottom is to become one of them, and see who looks at your face. She keeps her mother's laminated badge in her pocket. Ruth Ann Grant, Aide, County Home, 1971. 52 years old now. That badge, soft as cloth. Some mornings, she sits alone for a minute in the Cornelius Boyd wing, in a bright hallway, under working lights, and she thinks about a woman who died on a shelf in a corridor because nobody came when she rang. And then she gets up, and she opens the door, and she goes to see who needs seeing. Let me tell you why I told you this one. Somewhere, right now, tonight, there's a wing. They don't show the families. There's an old woman with a gray dot next to her name, who's been sitting in front of a television nobody chose, waiting on a call light. Nobody's coming to answer. There's a 20-year-old making $13 an hour, who is the only person in the whole building who sees her and who's about to get written up for it, and called aggressive for it, and starved out of a job for it. And there's a man in a charcoal suit up front, closing a deal by the mocktail bar, who calls that old woman charity trash, and calls that girl difficult, and calls the whole thing efficiency, and who has never once, not one time, I've been told no. Most of the time, the man in the suit wins. That's the truth. Most of the time, there's no billionaire who used to be that girl. Most of the time, the letter gets buried and stays buried. And Ms. Ruthie dies twice. and nobody ever learns her name. So don't wait for the lottery ticket. You are the person who gets to decide whether somebody dies twice. When you visit your own people, walk past the front lobby and go look at the back wing. When you hear somebody call a human being charity trash, or the inventory, or the difficult one, I don't laugh. The safe laugh with everybody else. And if you're the 20-year-old feeding an old man applesauce on your own break, in a building that punishes you for caring, hear me, you are not difficult. You are not aggressive. You are the most important person in that entire building. And one day, the whole country is going to figure out what your kind of person is worth. Somebody has to see them. If nobody sees them, they die twice. Be the one who sees them. If this story moved you, tell me in the comments about the caregiver in your life who saw people when nobody else would. I read everyone. Like this video, so it reaches a family who needs to hear it tonight. And subscribe, because next week, I'm telling you about a janitor a hospital fired for being too old to matter, not knowing he was the surgeon who built their trauma wing 40 years before. You are not invisible, and you are not walking close to walls anymore.